before I proceed further to explain what he is that I allow to be an architect. For it is not a carpenter or a joiner that I thus rank with the greatest masters in other sciences, the manual operator being no more than an instrument to the architect. Him I call an architect, who, by sure and wonderful art and method, is able, both with thought and invention, to devise and with execution to complete all those works which, by the movement of great weights and the conjunction and massement of bodies, can, with the greatest beauty, be adapted to the uses of mankind. To be able to do this, he must have a thorough insight into the noblest and most curious sciences. Such must be the architect. Lastly, in the study of his art, I would have him follow the example of those that apply themselves to letters, for no man thinks himself sufficiently learned in any science unless he has read and examined all the authors, as well bad as good, that have wrote in that science which he is pursuing.
You've got to read everything.
You have to read all the books.
All the books. I mean, what he's describing there is his own image of himself, right?
100%, yeah. There is no other
He
model.
missed off physical perfection, noble birth.
Welcome, listeners. This is about buildings and cities.
A podcast.
A podcast about architecture and many other things. I'm Luke Jones.
I'm George Kinjal.
And we are discussing today A Man and a Book. The man is the original big bouncing baby boy of the High Renaissance, really, I suppose, or the early Renaissance. Is he early or high?
High.
The original big strong boy of the High Renaissance.
Well, according to himself, there's no corroborating evidence at all.
Leon Battista Alberti and his book on architecture, De Re Aedificatoria. It's very long, and
it feels very long. I'm not sure it is especially long compared to. I mean, it's much shorter than like the Stones of Venice.
I'm going to be leading you through it. It's the first big book about architecture since classical antiquity, isn't it?
Yes, I mean the first book that's actually about architecture since classical antiquity, and there's exactly one in classical antiquity. So you could just say the second Western book on architecture.
Yeah.
Although there were quite a lot more coming very soon after him.
Yeah. And there are obviously also, rather incautiously, leave out the whole of Asia sometimes when they're talking about its significance.
Western.
Yeah, you said Western. There's a famous Chinese book surviving, I think, which is called, I believe, Ying Zhao Fa Shi, which I don't know what it means, but it's about construction, which is from the 8th century or something.
Yeah. So that's sort of like evenly between the two.
I have a copy of it, but I can't understand what it says.
Is it in classical Chinese?
I don't know what it might have been modernized, but it has a lot of pictures.
It's quite a big ask. Who gave you a book in classical Chinese?
My little brother.
That's a very generous gesture of him.
Yeah, he's a sweet boy. Yes. So
he's a big figure, isn't he? Alberti.
In the heroic chronology of Renaissance architects, he is number 2 after Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi having kind of inaugurated like Renaissance architecture and being really the start of the canon. He is a distinctly different character in the sense that Brunelleschi is first and foremost a kind of a craftsman, an inventor, a problem solver, and someone who I think didn't write anything at all. Whereas Alberti is the prototypical universal man, the uomo universale. He is a man of letters, physical as well as mental perfection. He's read literally all the books.
Yes. I think there's some he hasn't read, but we'll...
And he is someone who stresses first and foremost architecture as an act of reasoning, of lucid mental calculation, of a kind of whole process of conceiving something with the mind and with sort of various like design processes in advance of any of the actual business of building. As we heard in the quote before, for whom the craftsman is merely an instrument.
Yes, whereas all of the other ones were craftsmen. Brunelleschi was a craftsman. Bramante was a shepherd but then a craftsman. Michelangelo was a sculptor. Palladio was a builder. Alberti was an aristocrat. And then a Renaissance man. Sort of, he's probably the Renaissance man, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's...
More so than anyone else.
He did also build quite a number of buildings, which we're going to be discussing in a separate place to this.
Part 2.
They're
pretty good. All of these people do really good buildings, actually. Brunelleschi do really good buildings. Alberti, very good buildings, yes. Bramante, yes.
They're very good, rather strange. I'm looking forward to talking about them.
His ones are the weirdest until Michelangelo, I would say.
Yeah.
Michelangelo's are also strange. His are strange. That thing that we said of him, it's a highly intellectual exercise. He wasn't on the building sites. He didn't really even approve of that. What he did was write incredibly long letters with no illustrations as to how things should be done. I mean, there must have been some drawing at some point.
Yeah, someone must have done it.
They're very well worked out. I just don't believe
They were
an
done,
essay,
described.
however good your Latin is, and that's basically what all of the technical stuff is written only in Latin.
There's a classic essay about Alberti by Kenneth Clark, and in which he quotes this earlier essay by Jakob Burckhardt, which I think gives a flavour of the mythic Alberti. Leon Battista was, from his childhood, the first. Of his various gymnastic feats and exercises, we read with astonishment how, with his feet together, he could spring over a man's head. How, in the cathedral, he threw a coin in the air till it was heard to ring against the distant roof. How the wildest horses trembled under him. In 3 things he desired to appear faultless to others: in walking, in riding, and in speaking. And all the while he acquired every sort of accomplishment and dexterity, cross-examining artists, scholars, and artisans of all descriptions, down to the cobblers about the secrets of their craft. That which others created he welcomed joyfully, and held every human achievement which followed the laws of beauty for something almost divine. At the sight of noble trees and waving fields of corn he shed tears. Handsome and dignified old men he honoured as delights of nature, and could never look at them enough, and more than once when he was ill, the sight of a beautiful landscape cured him.
Oh, that's very sweet. He's kind of a little cute superhero architect. All of the physical things, by the way, we only have his own word in his autobiography.
Yeah.
When he was very old, he said, "When I was young, I used to be able to jump over a man standing with my feet tied together and, backflip over a horse and all of these things when I was young."
Yeah, when I was young.
Everyone seems to have just believed him. I meet people who are like that from time to time. How many, goalies for West Ham have you met in a pub? Or ex-SAS men?
Well, this is a phenomenon, isn't it?
Should we talk about him and where he comes from?
Let's try and locate him in time, because it's a very long time ago. He was born in 1404.
Well, that's good you remember the date.
In Genoa. His family were Florentine. They were exiles because of politics, of which there was a lot in those days.
He is one part of the, unsurprisingly, Alberti family, who were one of the major Florentine families who had been kicked out, not, as Aureli says, because of their interactions with is it Ciompi? But rather because of some shenanigans afterwards, but in the 1380s. And one branch of the family went to Genoa, others went all over the place. I think his mother was the second daughter of a local landowner. He's a member of a well-established aristocratic family, which has been going for a couple of 100 years and has got a few more 100 years to go.
And when he was a boy, they moved to Venice, where he had his kind of humanist schooling from about 7. I think when he was about 16, his father died, and he had to, he sort of fell out with the rest of the family because they wouldn't let him do what he wanted, and he went to Bologna. Also because he was suing them over bits of the inheritance. Classic. This is a story which will never go away. Long legal disputes over money. Well, and then he went to Bologna to study law.
Ferrara for 2 years first. Studying Greek philosophy and rhetoric. I think he was probably doing his trivia there. And then Bologna to study law and canon law.
And is that how he finds his way into the service of the Pope?
Yes. Bologna is the first European university to be established, and also, unusually, the rest sort of primarily taught the basic syllabus, the Cassiodorian syllabus, and then theology. Bologna teaches civil and canon, Roman and canon law, so Roman law and religious law, church law. He also seems to be a spectacularly good schmoozer.
Yeah.
He's very good
always
at it.
are.
He's very good at it, and he quite quickly gets... I can't remember the story of how he gets in, but he becomes an abbreviator, which is someone who works under the pro-notary.
What does that mean?
Originally, they're literally the people who do the legal abbreviations of notes, but I think at this point they're preparing the official legal documents of the Papal See. Papal history is very complicated, and there are lots of jobs, and it's all in Latin. I can't remember it very well.
Yeah.
Second tier bureaucrat, quite senior, gets a living quite early, becomes rector of some fairly well-off church in the middle of nowhere.
But he's able then, when he's in his sort of mid to late 20s, the family's exile ends and he's able to go back to Florence, and then quite soon after that he's able to go to Rome, which means that he sort of makes contact first with all of the big kind of figures in sort of humanist learning in Florence, and then also gets to go and see all of the Roman buildings in Rome.
Yeah, and is well into them. I totally believe this thing about him, that he did go to all of the Roman buildings he could find and measure them and look at them and poke in them, which is something he said he did. I think he's well into it.
And so then this book, I think he'd been writing basically continuously since his late teens, different sorts of things.
The first successful one is on bishops, and after that there's one on like oikonomia, like bringing up the family. I'm not sure he'd approve of the Greek word.
Well, I mean, we'll get back onto the family. The family in this era sort of means everyone who lives in your household. Like, it includes your servants as well as
your tattles and properties.
And also your guests sometimes.
Yeah, so like a big family would live in a big house, like either in the country or in the city, or they'd have both. And they would have them, their landed estates, all the people who work in it, all their personal servants, all of the people they sort of help for political reasons. That's what the family is.
I think he was then writing this in, like the late 1430s, I think, this book. But it didn't get published for a long time.
Earlier than I've heard. But I think something is that actually it's pretty shrouded in the exact mechanics of it, are a bit shrouded in history.
I'm wrong about that. I think he was writing it in the early 1440s, possibly, or between 1443 and 1452. That's what it says on
a version of it is dedicated to Pope Nicholas. I think, is that Nicholas of the Nicolaitan Chapel? It's a famous chapel in the Vatican painted by Fra Angelo, by which it is extended that it must be at least some version of it written at that point, although he may have continued to edit it. And at that point, he hadn't done much building. The Palazzo Rucellai is being done around that time, and I don't know when he's in Rimini. We haven't got. We'll get a much better chronology
on the buildings in the next bit.
Buildings in the next one, and probably his life in general. I think we could probably actually just be kind of a bit sweeping and then sort it out for the next one where
one important thing about when he was writing the book is that people think he hadn't quite got his head around the invention of printing, which had only happened in 1439, although it became known quite quickly, hadn't quite sort of penetrated. One of the things which is famous about this book is that it doesn't, in the original, contain any illustrations at all. And one of the theories for this is that he was still in the mindset that books had to be reproduced by copying, and that images are very unreliable when copied by one scribe after another. They very quickly get sort of mangled.
I don't totally buy this theory. I think partly he was copying Vitruvius, but also we don't have any drawings surviving by him, basically. And he wrote these copiously long letters to the people running the building sites, describing what they were to do. And then this thing must be this wide, followed by this thing this wide, followed by a swirling volute of these proportions, 5, 3, 8, 9. This is an extremely strange way of specifying. I think that's kind of just how he rolled as well. And also, I mean, Vitruvius may have come out with pictures, but it certainly didn't have pictures as it is passed down to us.
Yeah.
So it may just be how he rolled. In the totally pedestrian history of architecture theory in there, there's only one book with drawings in it of any sort in Europe before this point, which is a really dodgy medieval copybook. So I mean, it perfectly well could be true, but it doesn't need to be. But what was certainly true is that very soon after this, all of the other ones and all of the other ones that have ever subsequently written architecture books had pictures in them. And most of the published versions of this, from fairly shortly after he was dead, they sort of filled in the drawings for him. The best one is one of the really early ones where they're all woodcuts. And they're kind of cute. The one we've got they're not that good.
So shall we go into the book? You mentioned Vitruvius, and consciously, of course, this is an updating of Vitruvius.
Yeah, I mean, so Vitruvius has written this supposedly universal book on architecture right at the beginning of the Roman Empire, after the end of the Republic. It's unsatisfactory in a number of ways. It doesn't really do any of the interesting bits of Roman architecture, which is one problem with it, because a lot of them hadn't happened yet. And also, it's quite badly written and pretty incomprehensible. It's got some strange bits. It's got a good bit on music and catapults.
Later on in the book, he talks about his motivation for writing it, and it's kind of anchored in his love of classical learning. He says, "The labour indeed was much more than I could have foreseen at the beginning of this undertaking. Continual difficulties of every moment arose, either in explaining the matter, or inventing names, or methodising the subject, which perfectly confounded me, and disheartened me from my undertaking. It grieved me that so many of the great and noble instructions of the ancient authors should be lost by the injury of time, so that scarce any but Vitruvius has escaped this general wreck, a writer indeed of universal knowledge, but so maimed by age, and in many places there are great chasms, and many things imperfect in others. Besides this, his style is absolutely void of all ornaments, and he wrote in such a manner that to the Latins he seems to write Greek, and to the Greeks Latin. Indeed, it is plain from the book itself that he wrote neither Greek nor Latin, and he might almost as well have never wrote at all, at least with regard to us, since we cannot understand him."
In one way, he's being very cruel, or making unreasonable criticism, but one way being very favourable. He seems to be suggesting that the problem with Vitruvius' book is that lots of it is missing, which is not the problem with it. The problem with it is that he didn't write lots of it in a way that made any sense. And he has to make up lots of words, and he sort of knows Greek architecture better. Bit of a burn. And Alberti's meant to have had very good Latin. We're reading from a slightly iffy mid-18th century out-of-copyright translation, because it can be downloaded off the internet.
It's been translated first into Italian and then into 18th century English, and it's...
If you're a fan of the long S,
yes,
this book is for you.
The long S that looks like an F. There's a lot of
which
double
is now
takes.
Used exclusively in integration. Yeah, so also all of the quotes you'll be hearing are in 18th century English.
Yeah, but that's all right. You just got to get through that.
It was written a long time ago.
Yeah, it does make it sound suitably oldie-worldy. So there's a preface.
Good. It's a good way to start.
There's a preface, and both the preface and the first part, what he's really concerned to do is to stress the great honour and status of the architect as a figure. As we heard at the beginning, what a wonderful sort of person they are, how learned, how great.
So strong, so grave, so earnest, brilliant, decisive.
So sensitive.
Attuned,
yes,
calm.
Yes. And then also, really, he wants to articulate who the architect is, what architecture is, and then latterly starting to give a bit of a conceptual view of what design is as a process, and how he sort of conceptualizes it. So, there are these. This is an artifact of the 18th century translation, but there were bits of this which had a weirdly Miss Jean Brodie-ish quality. There's a bit where he says, "You shall find nobody who has the means, but what has an inclination to be building something."
They didn't have as much to spend it on back then. What this reminded me more than anything else is Tristram Shandy. It's written this translations were around the same time, and that's the same insane rambling quality. Alberti, known everywhere you will hear discussion of this person, you will hear one thing about him: he is a fabulous stylist.
Yes, a fabulous.
His prose is limpid and clear.
We're separated from that by two translations, but it may also not actually be true.
More of that later. Only I suppose people who have even better Latin than him can really judge. And in more than one answer to a lecture where someone has challenged something, the person will sort of basically go, "Your Latin's not good enough to understand the subtlety and genius of this."
To the intent that the architect may come off worthily and honourably, there are some necessary admonitions, which he should by no means neglect. And first he ought to consider well what weight he is going to take upon his shoulders, what it is that he professes, what manner of a man he would be thought, how great a business he undertakes, how much applause, profit, favour and fame among posterity he will gain when he executes his work as he ought. And, on the contrary, if he goes about anything ignorantly, unadvisedly, or inconsiderately, to how much disgrace, to how much indignation he exposes himself. What a clear, manifest, and everlasting testimony he gives mankind of his folly and indiscretion. So I think we heard a little bit at the start about the figure of the architect, all of the things which you ought to know, how universally accomplished it's necessary to be. But there's something important about the way in which he thinks architecture happens, which distinguishes it from mere building or all of these other ignoble professions.
His architecture's definitely got a capital A.
Yeah, very big one. And it is something which is conceived in its totality. It's kind of understood structurally, not so much literally structurally, as in the relation of all of the parts and their kind of wholeness. And it is something whose completion in some way completely prefigures any of the building happening.
Architects have been trying to do this forever. It never works very well. What it is you sit in a corner and you think and think and think until you pass out, and it pops out this perfect building. And the building is perfect and harmonious in every way. It's a bit like that, his sort of design model. Well, we'll talk, yeah. Rather like him, I will say, more of that later. But unlike him, we will actually answer it.
He sort of further breaks this down, and he gives an account of, well, you probably want to think about things in this order. And he says fundamentally the whole art of building consists in 6 things. And I'm sorry, we only have these in the 18th century version, which are the region, the seat or platform.
The region which would be the site. Seat or platform. This is something which we do not have an idea of. This is like the groundworks. Building starts with digging. You dig a hole.
I think also it sort of also includes building up the sort of plinth level.
Yeah, that's it. You dig a hole and you fill it in.
The kind of socle level of the building. The compartition is very enigmatic.
The walls.
The walls, yes. But then there's also the walling. I think the compartition is the disposition of the different bits. So the courtyard, the rooms, the portico, the entrance.
Perhaps you call that the laying out?
I think so. It's kind of the party.
You know, there's a great fondness for incomprehensible numbered lists with 1A, B, C these days. He loves an incomprehensible, rambling, unnumbered list.
The walling, well, that's straightforward. The covering, which is the roof.
Yes.
And the apertures.
Yes, which are of 2 kinds. One of which is doors and windows, and one of which is vents.
Yes, the kind for air and the kind for people.
Well, no, he has one which is doors and windows, which are both of which are subdivided again into 1A and 1B, being 1A doors, 1B windows, 2A chimneys, 2B sort of vents in the wall for letting moisture come out, and bad airs that rise from the earth. And there it is shown. That is what a building doth consist of.
Yeah, those are all of the bits. But it's important you have a sort of a sequential logic. You work through the bits, starting sort of zooming out, and then starting from the bottom and working up, and then working down to the level of these sort of smaller bits.
That's kind of a linear process to what you design in general, where you choose where it's going to go, how it's going to fit into the site.
Yeah.
So where it's going to go is the region, how it's going to fit into the site is kind of the platform. The rough massing is kind of the compartment. How you're going to build it is sort of the walls, and then the roof, and then you think about where the doors and windows go.
Yeah.
It's sort of like intellectually assembling the building in that way. But that's just kind of one way of doing it.
I think that there's a general problem with Alberti, which is that the really noticeable parts of the text are where he said something very strange. Yeah. And that many of the things where he may be being genuinely insightful are difficult to see or difficult to credit because they're just staggeringly obvious.
Now, it's strange. You'll see sort of expressed in a different way something which is completely logical and obvious. But then but interspersed with things that are completely insane. We'll have some of the more extraordinary examples, but very early on, mundane example, he's talking about digging foundations. And he says, well, there are all these rules of different sorts of grounds which have different levels of bearing that they can associate with them. The best thing to do, actually, is just to ask people who've built in the area what they think's best. And to use bricks that have been dried in the air for no less than 2 years. One thing is completely correct and reasonable to this day, and the other thing is insane and nonsensical.
Yeah, it's just a completely mistaken understanding of...
I don't know where it comes from. He says that, he's read lots of stuff in books, and he's quite good and skeptical. He's looked at lots of stuff, and he's done some building. Although not very much at this point, I think.
We'll come on to the materials in a second. I want to say one more thing about design process, which is that he does, as well as having this method, he has some advice about technique, which is that he favours models. He thinks wooden models.
A rather specific sort of model, yes, which is you should do at least one, maybe several, develop them. They shouldn't look too pretty.
Yeah, very against prettiness.
Not something that ever happens to this day, is it, where people make really showy presentations to try and get clients to build things?
Yes. I must not omit to observe that the making of curious polished models with the delicacy of painting is not required from an architect that only designs to show the real thing itself, but is rather the part of a vain architect that makes it his business by charming the eye and striking the fancy of the beholder to divert him from a rigorous examination of the parts which he ought to make.
So, that's a bit of a burn to the Bartlett there.
That's true, isn't it? Well, I mean, it's all. Everyone knows one of these people from their studio, don't they? Where it's like, let's Photoshop in like a really beautiful sky or something.
Yeah. I mean, that seems like a quite benign. It's just, it's occasionally coming up that people are sued because the building does not look like the render. This is a bit of an unsettled area of legal practice.
Bring it on.
And he says you should continue to work with the model and around the model until you understand everything and how everything is put together with it.
Something we'll get into later is that a big part of his theory of form is based around mathematical proportion, symmetry, and various sorts of kind of rules and ratios and things. But we'll get into that a little bit later because it comes in a lot more with reference to specific types of buildings and ornament. The second book is where he talks about materials, and it's a real sort of info dump. There's a huge amount of stuff about...
This book has some general tendencies, which is that he will sort of start with a little preface and then have a huge lot of information. And the information will be derived from like several different sources, one of which is everything he's read in every book that existed up to that time, which will be a collection of things which are contradictory, strange, seemingly rambling, things that he knows from the experience of people at the time, and things that he's seen in Roman ruins.
It's interesting.
They're not interesting to read, are they?
Well, no. So just to say, the materials chapter, he goes through all of the main materials of building: stone, brick, timber. Talks a little bit about metal, but not very much. Lots on lime, lots on sand. And he has lots of advice for the way in which you use them and all these sorts of things. One of the moments where this book seems strangest is the way in which he uses his sources. So as you say, he has classical authors. He has his own kind of archaeological explorations of Roman ruins. He has his own experience.
I'm not sure at this point he'd really built anything.
Must have,
almost nothing.
Some kind of whatever, he's sort of seen, and then talking to and getting the advice from all sorts of craftsmen and different people and what they say. The book is strangest where he'll be talking about lime mortar, and he'll say like, well, Cato says that you should use a mix of 1 lime to 2 sand. As if this was the appropriate source rather than people who are just doing this in everyday life in his time.
Yeah. I mean, Cato's not wrong. Cato's advice seems to be quite similar. Cato's is you can use 3 parts sharp sand or 2 parts river sand, which is rounder, because sharp sand's got a better bearing.
Yeah. Or,
right?
There's a bit here where he goes, Theophrastus thinks that timber is not dry enough for the making of planks, especially for doors, in less than 3 years.
Yeah, I don't know anything about seizing timber, but that seems a little excessive.
It does seem a little bit, but it's also there's clearly a hierarchy where the most favoured source is the writings of the ancients.
Well, sort of. Because he will record them things that he sort of thinks are plausible from them, but he also will record things that are like contradictory and say, make of this what you wish. And then in addition to that, he will also say, make of it what you wish. And then in addition, there's all this magical nonsense, which I don't believe in.
In the end, I think that for him it's necessary, or for him rather, like his knowledge of those authors is the thing which he thinks makes him look best.
Yes.
So that they have a position in the book which is a little bit contradictory, because it's not necessarily that he puts most faith in them, but they're given kind of primacy of framing.
There'll be, in the chapter, there'll normally be a little introduction, and then there'll be a big lot of stuff from classical antiquity, starting with the stuff that he thinks is general, then good, and then ridiculous. If there's really silly stuff, it goes at the end, which means it's very strange. Like, there's that bit where it's 3 parts sharp sand and 2 parts normal sand to that. It makes a good wall, says Cato. Other people say that, oh no, and that will do enough for lime, except to say that some people have noticed that laurel trees and this creature is never struck by lightning. And so if laurel trees and eagles are not struck by lightning, so that if you put them in the wall, your building will not be struck by lightning. I'm not sure about this. And that comes right after, like, literally the recipe for ready mix.
It's fun. Yeah, there's all this stuff about... he has a lot on the different types of trees and, their respective hardness. He has a theory both about, obviously, different types of trees have different qualities, and then also the way they grow gives them different qualities, and then also the way that you harvest them gives them different qualities.
Some of which is true.
Yeah, some of which is extremely true. On pine and stuff, he's bang on the money. But then also, he kind of understands the cosmology which he inhabits. A lot of this, by the way,
comes also from Vitruvius, which talks about wood in this sort of quasi-magical... Vitruvius is strange in that he is a builder who doesn't believe sort of in magic, and so always has these non-magical explanations for the magic that people do. Yeah. Like, when you're finding out where the good place is, it's very good to kill a lamb and look at its liver so you can see what herbs it's been eating, so you can tell what the underbearing is like.
And there's lots of stuff about how you have to bury some of them in dung or something, and then they become impervious to moisture.
And they did do some of this. Some of this stuff is real and sort of works. But it's all... I don't think has personally done any of it, and has got it all from books.
Yeah. There's something important about the kind of cosmos which he inhabits, which is one in which, like, the seasons and to some extent, I guess, like the movements of celestial bodies and things are also as consequential as these other sorts of things which are going on. Like that they...
It's very curious because I don't think he believes in it.
Yeah, I wonder.
He says he doesn't believe it. Like, there's a long bit on astronomy when setting out a building, or not particularly, but there's a chunk on, like, which star sign and whatever, and the moon being in Libra and all that sort of thing. And he's like, I don't hold any store by any of this, but I suppose it can't do any harm. The early Renaissance, astrology is just super part of the worldview. And it's like he doesn't really believe in the humours, but he sort of has humoral explanations. And he doesn't really believe... He does believe massively in the power of, like, airs to do things, like bad airs rising from the earth.
Yeah, here's a bit. Yeah, if you bark a fir by the light of the moon, it is safe from moisture.
Biodynamic farming. Yes, definitely bury that horn. It will really set the humus a balance.
When he gets onto the discussion of stone, there's a lot of this as well, the way in which they're affected by moisture.
But I mean, it is true that when you cut lime in a quarry, you have to leave it to cure, which he says, and then he'll say some stuff about
But he thinks it's true of a lot of stones, though.
Well, it's true of lime affiliated. Like he says, the stones that look most like salt are hardest to work. Like, that's like granite, isn't it? It's got quartz crystals in it. And you're sort of seeing this stuff and, like, working it out. It really feels like you're looking at it from underneath. It's like seeing this stuff in a way of someone who doesn't know the stuff which is kind of primary school learning now, you know. He
has a nice bit where he says that if you've got some stones and if you're making a lime mortared wall, if the lime is made out of the same kind of stone as the stones that you're walling, they will stick together much better because they know each other.
Yes. And a stone once stuck will not want to be stuck again because it knows the stuckness.
It's kind of lovely, but strange.
There's a bit which is like, an incredible discovery has been made under Rome! Exclamation mark. Rocks grow deep in the earth. Someone has found a number of pieces of rock, and they have been joined together over time in the earth.
Yeah, they germinate under the earth.
They germinate under the earth, and he's really excited by this.
Well, I don't think he imagines this as a hot process. That it's a sort of like a congealing of liquid. He describes how that's where the veining of rocks comes from.
It isn't necessarily super hot. You don't need lots of heat for the formation of oolitic limestone from oolites. He's fascinated and excited by where rocks come from. He'll say things like, I won't speculate about where the rocks come from. And then he'll speculate and get very excited about where the rocks come from.
People, in one sense, can seem to be very progressive, like they can seem to be very modern in the past. But this belief in all sorts of things which seem very strange and very magical. But their magical belief is not necessarily retrograde. It may be very connected to their kind of forward-looking beliefs. I was thinking of, like a couple of centuries later, like Giordano Bruno, or, who believed on life on other planets and that kind of thing, was equally, convinced of all of this kind of magical astrology stuff.
Newton was trying to make gold from base metals and had some strange theory about, how God works in vacuums.
It's all very interesting. There's something important in the way in which he understands nature and its relation to architectural design and process, which is that you have to work with nature. And that in this work of reasoning, which characterizes the architectural design, you have to consider the sort of propensities of the different materials and also what the site is like. All of these things have to be considered. And he says very clearly several times that you can really try and go against nature, but in the end, it's always going to be a mistake. You have to try and think how you can use these things which are at hand to in an advantageous way.
It's something where it shows that worldview you were just describing quite well, because what is the nature that he's talking about? Obviously, you've got to work with the conditions at hand. That's an obvious observation. What are those conditions? Well, they're the nature of the wind and the sun, the sort of position of airs and waters, the physical materials, perhaps the astrological conditions?
I think so, yeah.
Certain landscapes are inclined towards hot and masculine or whatever, but also that you should use locally available materials and, where things exist, work with that and consider logistics. And no one writing a handbook on how to build buildings would go, you should disregard where you are.
No.
Site, scale, and material conditions are irrelevant.
Yeah, no, of course they're not.
But then you've got to go, what qualities are you interested in?
Yeah.
What is it that's important about the nature of the place?
Yeah.
And for him, it's an interesting hodgepodge because it's that humoral stuff, practical things.
You want all the nice resources.
Social things. Also, he's not really in favour of doing too much demolition. He doesn't have a problem with old buildings. He doesn't think you should tear things down wantonly. That's all part of it.
But he's very much convinced of the power of certain sites and their effect on people. There's this very amusing passage where he says, by what marks and characters we are to know the goodness of the region, and the goodness and also the badness in this case. He has an amusing bit where he says, I have myself seen some cities, which out of respect to the times I forbear to name, where there is scarce a woman, but what sees herself at the same instant the mother of both a man and a monster. Another city, I know in Italy, where there are so many people humpbacked, squint-eyed, crooked and lame, that there is scarce a family, but what has somebody in it defective or distorted. And
this is because they've got bad air.
Bad air, yeah, the wind blows in the wrong way. Or
in Vitruvius, there's a bit where he says, you've got to have your city on a grid, but the grid must be at right angles to the compass points. Otherwise, the winds will blow in, the cardinal winds, and they will whistle down the streets and cause problems. Also, I can't remember. I read it when I was a teenager, and I'm sure I've garbled it, but
Yes, air is very important. You've got to have the good air.
He says, man, by labours, can solve the deficiencies of water and land, but not of air. So you must site well in air.
That's interesting, yeah. I mean, we're seeing a strong Banham resonance, aren't we? Like,
Well, no, I thought this would be great after Bannon. That's why I said we should do it, because he's. Oh, that was definitely part of the program. Rather like I quite kind of liked Akira and Hawksmoor.
he's also a misogynist.
Yes, just like Bannon.
Yeah.
Just like Rainer Banham.
There's a bit of that to come later.
People in the past, they had bad attitudes.
And people in the present are not in all respects better.
That's true, but they are better at covering themselves to contemporary mores, of which he does not know anything.
Right, so we've got to the end of
Book 1 of 10.
I think book 2, actually. We've sort of talked through book 2. We might say something about the structure of the book, which one of the sources which is worth, if you really want to dig into this stuff, there's quite a nice lecture about it on the AA website by Pier Vittorio Aureli. And one of the arguments that he makes is that the structure of the book kind of echoes the famous Vitruvian triad.
Yeah, and this isn't particularly his idea. Utilitas, commoditas, firmitas. No, sorry. Utility, firmity, and delight. What's delight? It's
Consilitas, something.
Yeah.
I
don't speak Latin.
I keep thinking dignitas.
Dignitas. Yes, what, like the Swiss death clinic?
The Swiss euthanasia clinic.
Yeah.
Yes. It doesn't quite make sense. But the thing is, actually, the book is way more mixed up than that.
He can't stay on topic. It's Aureli. That lecture's lovely. But it gives you a completely wrong idea of the book.
Yeah.
The book is not like that at all. He paints a picture of something which is sort of logical, coherent, about architecture, and in exemplary style. And everyone should read it because it's so limpid. It's rambling.
It's very rambling.
He can't stay on the topic for like 30 seconds. He says the same thing again and again and again, like a drunk.
It's very interesting.
It's great.
I think I would.
He's very funny.
I think I probably would recommend reading it, but probably not at the pace that we had to.
No, it's not great for cramming. He's very droll. He's kind of nihilistic. He's got lots of amusing and very submerged political observations, which I think are more subtle than he is given credit for. It's got strange bits of satire, which I can't kind of... It's got that kind of like Italian sense of irony where it's both ironic and not at all ironic, which says a lot about Italian taste, I think.
I mean, one last thing which is nice about materials, well, there are two things. One is that he's a great partisan of brick. He says brick is as good a material as any, and if it were up to me, I think we could build everything out of brick.
Yeah, a long time ago in the AJ, Architect Journal, before it went massively downhill, a load of like technical professionals were asked, I may have gone back uphill again, were asked what they thought the most important architectural innovation was. And they were all like, BIM, like end processing. And then one guy said, bricks. They are the best thing that's happened in the history of architecture. And
they are
really good.
Yeah. I think they need to evolve a little bit. I think they're slightly stuck.
Alberti, as we know, is a great partisan of the triangular brick, which he finds very much the most superior sort. 4 can be held on the hand like a pizza, and they are sort of put so that they are interleaved with each other, leaving a wall that looks like it's made of rectangular bricks, but actually it's interlocking triangles.
The other thing is that particularly when he's talking about stone, you get into this other thing which is nice, which is that loads of it is based on travel. So he just talks about all of these different places in Italy.
Oh, I get that thing that I have with Ruskin where I'm like, stop rambling on. But I do want to be in Venice before they built the bridge. Yeah, like, I do want to be in... He's talking about old St. Peter's in Rome. And he's talking about the good and the bad things about it.
He's talking about all these lovely...
And he's like, part of the reason I've got to write this down is that all the Roman ruins in Rome are falling apart and having all their marble nicked off them. He doesn't say by popes, but that's very much the case. And I'm like, damn right, it all has.
Yeah, it's happened.
Things were in much better shape in his day.
So the book 3 is on the work.
He goes over again those parts of the thing, but he elaborates them more. With this bit, I felt, oh my God, we've done it again. I'm reading The Stones of Venice again. I'm reading a man spending 3 pages defining what a wall is, with reference to lots of classical authors.
It kind of rambles all over the place. And a lot of it, I think, he's sort of saying things that he knows have buildings. We get a bit of buildings that have gone wrong, don't we? He's like, oh well, the Venetians built a tower and they didn't put proper foundations under it, so it sank all the way down until it was just the top of it poking out the ground.
That all around everything is filled up with rubbish, and they just leave rubbish all around, and they didn't put the building on a plinth, and so it's got sunk. He's also prepared to say, which is really unusual in these old books, I'm not sure which of these is best. You should try it out. Probably what's cheapest for you at that time will work best, is something he says. Yeah. Which is good advice.
Yeah, and we do get a bit of Herodotus at this point, where he's talking about roofs, and he's saying, well, in this part of the world, people are said to use tortoise shells, and here they.
Seriously, it would be like, I've looked around Rome. You can build with these foundations, and it's amazing. Some of the buildings that are really old don't seem to have any foundations at all. Compacted gravel's great. Build a trench. Except in, as Herodotus says, in the distant Indies, where people live in giant hollowed out coconuts. Whatever. Like, it's got that, again, that quality of like shifting from the extremely pedestrian to the magical and insane very quickly.
Foundations are best dug while the sun is in Leo.
That's jolly good, yes.
The best time for laying on the coat is about the rising of the stars, called the Pleiades. So I think enough of that, but we'll...
Just look, by the way, like, the book is like this all the way through, very much.
I guess for me, I did find the materials bit really fun, and I think one of the things that you get a sense of is that he's delighted in the world and its variety.
He's really into these questions. He loves finding out about stuff. He loves speculating about where the materials come from. The reason why he puts this sort of crazy stuff in that, you know, people in these different places have these crazy solutions is that he loves the idea that that's how it is. He finds it so exciting that there's this boundless world with all these exciting different things in it.
And although formally he's very much in love with, you know, a kind of like fundamental, like geometric simplicity.
As soon as he gets off, he's into other things.
But that doesn't mean that he wants to reduce anything or that he thinks that everything is kind of known.
This is something that genuinely I wasn't sure which way it would go and slightly surprised me. He's not at all anti-Gothic. The Gothic hasn't been defined yet. I'll just talk about it like a couple of observations I had throughout the book. Like, he talks about what are the best arches to make and he goes through them, and he's got nothing against pointed arches. He thinks they might be best in certain circumstances. And when he says, what's the best ceiling for a church? It's definitely gilt mosaic, which is Romanesque. He's very open-minded. And then at the same time, will sort of say the same Renaissance things that he's meant to say.
No, I think it's good. And there'll be more to say about that when we get onto the buildings. I will now, by way of epilogue, give you a law of very great antiquity among architects, which, in my opinion, ought no less to be observed than the answers of oracles, and it is this. Make your foundation as strong as possible. Let the superstructure lie exactly plumb to its centre. Fortify the corners and ribs of the wall from the bottom to the top with your largest and strongest stones. Soak your lime well. Do not use your stone till it is thoroughly watered. Set the hardest sort to that side which is most exposed to injuries. Raise your wall exactly by the square, level and plumb line. Let the middle of the upper stone lie directly upon the meeting of the two below it. Lay entire stones in the courses and fill up the middle with the broken pieces. Bind the inward and outward shells to one another by frequent crosses or band stones. Let this suffice with relation to the wall. We come now to the covering, but I will not pass over one thing which I find that ancients observed very religiously. There are some things in nature which are endued with the properties by no means to be neglected, particularly that the laurel tree, the eagle, and the sea calf are never to be touched by lightning. There are some, therefore, who suppose that if these are enclosed in the wall, the lightning will never hurt it. This I take to be just as probable as another wonderful thing which we are told, that the land toad, or ruddock, if shut up in an earthenware pot and burned in a field, will drive away the birds from devouring the seeds, and that the tree Olferius, brought into a house will obstruct a woman's delivery, and that the leaves of the lesbian enemy kept but under the roof will give a flux of the belly and an evacuation that will certainly prove mortal. And let us now return to our subject, for a better understanding of which it will be proper to look back what we have formerly laid of the lines of building. So it's just this weird little excursion where it's like, oh, there's a special tree which will make someone shit themselves to death.
Yes. like to summarize that, it's like compacted hardcore foundation, lay stones together, consider wind damage, like apply bracings to your like cavity walls, bury a dead toad, and there's a certain sort of tree that will make someone shit themselves to death. It's like that all the way through. It's completely mad. That's his ceremony. That's his summation of what the ancients.
Bigger stones at the corners.
Bury
a dead eagle inside the wall. In book 4, we start to move into the consideration of the city, and as part of that, we're also going to be introduced to the sort of the main sorts of buildings, and also the main sorts of people.
Not last time.
Well, he says there are two sorts of buildings. There are public buildings and private buildings, and there are two sorts of people. There are important people, and there are unimportant people.
This is after he said for a very long time, every different theory of class he's managed to dig up from every book that he has ever read.
God, yeah, no, I glazed over a bit in that.
I read all of that assiduously. I was still in my assiduous reading bit.
There are three kinds of building. One sort belongs to the public, another to the principal citizens, and another to the commonalty.
This is how, by the way, he thinks it should be. This is his proposed system, as opposed to all of the other systems.
We get a whole lot more about region and bad winds and things again, but we can gloss over that.
I think we can quite quickly skip all over that. He's rather reprising stuff he's already said.
I mean, there are various things to say about this. There's a nice bit where he's really interested in how towns can be beautiful and how they can be delightful to explore as well. Yeah. It's not the sort of crystalline, static beauty of the set piece, the grand square or whatever. He thinks is really lovely when he talks about how you could have like a street in a town in a sort of smallish town. The best thing would be to have a main street which sort of winds like the course of a river, and then you'll be forever encountering something new, and you'll see one lovely thing after another.
And also it's good if it does that on the outside, because you can be continuously throwing rocks upon the assailants. There's all of the descriptions of cities are drenched in and this is a great place to be pouring boiling oil upon all of the people from the next village over.
Yeah, there's a lot of fortification chat, which is not super interesting.
It's also in Vitruvius is like 50% military or like 30% military.
So there's a bit about this which is about what we might think of as infrastructure. He talks about like drains and harbours and those kinds of things.
I find this bit very boring. Bridges.
There's a nice bit where he throws some shade. He says Siena, are now much touristed, a city in Tuscany, not having drains, wants a very great help to cleanliness, by which means the town not only stinks every day and morning when people throw their nastiness out of the windows, but even in the daytime. Bit of Tuscan.
That's it. Actually, most of the great things in Siena were already done by this point.
This also is a part where the book becomes quite political. I mean, there's this political context which I don't know anything about, but where in the era of his parents, they'd had what's this like rebellion of the Ciompi or something. Is that it? Or the
yes. When his parents were young, I would say. So after
he says, so in Aurelius' lecture, he talks about them, and he says that they're kind of like a kind of proletariat.
In a way, that's true. After the plague. Across Europe, there are a series of revolts against the sort of aristocratic order. This one is interesting. It happens within Florence, which is an independent city. And it's quite a complicated thing. The same thing is happening, which is that the price of labour has gone up because half of the people have died. The city is controlled basically by guilds, which are semi-controlled by rich people. The rich people are like financiers. They make money from nothing, but sort of pretend to be doing other things. And then there's a kind of hierarchy. And this system has become unstable because of increasing price of labour. So there's the guild structure, which control trade guilds. The big business in Florence is making wool, as it is in all the developed bits of Europe, sort of through Lothringham, right, like England. It starts initially with the lower guilds trying to get more power. There are people well represented, rich people who are badly represented, the middle trades, which in this case is like weavers and like fullers and things like that. The people who produce and process wool, a cloth, and then there are the totally unrepresented, which are carders, things that are not regarded as good enough to be in trade bodies. And being in a guild is the way you have power in the city and can pass laws, for example, on taxation. So the really poor are being... But basically what happens is the system becomes unstabilized when the rich sort of try and push down on the middle classes, and then everything flips, and the sort of middle class guilds... I mean, when I say middle class, I mean extremely poor, but not utterly destitute. They have a rebellion and take over the city. And rather like the peasants' revolt, it's kind of not led by peasants. It's kind of led by the upper working class, or the trades. And they manage to gain control of the city for 3 years, and it sort of falls apart. The government of Florence is continually in a state of flux with different factions, and it's sort of... I don't know the whole history.
It's important because for him it creates the sort of the spectre of the mob, the spectre of the rabble taking over the city.
His family weren't exiled by that and supported it. So that, like a number of the aristocratic, it's also a play of different aristocratic communities against each other. So it's complicated.
When he talks about the planning of cities, one of the things he thinks he sort of describes is that it's very important for whoever's in authority to think about how their soldiers can move around unmolested, and how, if necessary, they can...
Well, he talks about this in the context of the houses and cities of tyrants, which he's being a little bit satirical about. It's totally hard to work out where he stands. He sort of says, well, to make the city peaceable, it's better that it be divided. Cities with a big river running through them are less prone to internal strife because they're divided in two. Wise people would divide their city in two by walls. And then, those walls should be armoured on both sides to prevent... And also, even better would be to have 2 rings of the city and have the poor people in the middle and the rich people on the outside, so you can't get them out. And the rich people can have all of the land and luxury, and the poor people can be all stuck in the middle with a wall all around them.
Yeah. There should be no arches nor towers in the street that lead from the fortress into the city.
This isn't talking about the ideal city. This is the city that is ruled by the tyrant.
The prince, yes.
He has a prince in one thing, but he also... This is, I think, when he's talking about kings and tyrants.
This one is the prince. He says... Okay. Nor leads or terraces from whence the soldiers may be molested with stones or darts as they pass to their duty. In a word, the whole should be so contrived that every place in which any way commands the town should be in the hands of the prince, and that it should be not in the power of any person whatsoever to prevent his men from overrunning the whole city as he pleases.
Before this, he's talked about the house of the king. I mean, the house of the king and the house of the tyrant. He's talking about how to build houses. Houses for tyrants. Houses for tyrants should be big castles, well defended on the edge of the city wall. They should have no buildings around them, and should be full of good listening channels so that the tyrant can hear anything that his servants and visitors may be saying. And he has a thing where he plays off the idea of kind of good and bad government with kings and tyrants. And then he goes on to say, but really, in republics, this is how it should be. It's very hard to work out because he's also very reactionary.
And there isn't as much of that as you might think. I mean, actually in chapters 4 and 5, the biggest part is what the house of one of these principal citizens or kind of semi-aristocrats should be like, and how it should be laid out.
At the beginning, there's this bit which I think is satire. Just because it's satire doesn't mean that doesn't think that the working people should be kept in their place. But it's satire where he talks about the houses of tyrants, cities of tyrants, cities of kings. And then it quickly gets on to, but what about republics? And then it spends a lot of time talking about how the different houses and things in republics should be, which he breaks down in great length and rather less jokily.
But even in republics, you've got the houses which matter are those of the principal citizens.
Yes. Why is this important? Because that is who he is.
That's him, yeah.
Like he can mock the tyrants and their like horrific organizations of control, and that's how you should do that. But that's because the best city is one that's run by rich people like him.
Yeah, as indeed a lot of these cities were, I guess. One of the things I enjoyed in his discussion of the house, so he talks about the house in the city and the house in the country are different. in The House in the City, one of the things I enjoyed is the way in which he thinks about this threshold condition between the private space of the house and the public space of the city, and the way in which that is used by different people. So he talks a lot about the portico and how the portico of the house kind of belongs to the city, and it belongs to passers-by.
So where people, like, you're going in to see the great man, you leave your, like, son out, and he should be able to, like, exercise healthily.
Yes, he has to be able to, like, do wrestling in the courtyard with the other fine lads. Yes. And then also the vestibule is a very important area. He thinks, the finest thing is you have a vestibule, it has glass windows, and you have your servants are there, and you meet certain people in the vestibule.
And then if you really want to divide people, you have multiple doors, and different grades of visitors go through different doors.
And then, of course, you have your courtyard. You have to have a chapel off the vestibule, so that people arriving can go and, pray before you go on to other business. And then you have various parlours, which are just, everything else is rooms, basically, isn't it?
I wonder if he's translated sala as parlour.
Yeah, I think so. I imagine that's probably how it is. Sorry, anyone who knows anything about this is going to have to forgive all the various malapropisms in there. The other nice thing is that he sort of, I guess, reflects on the way in which the family, which includes also all of its servants and functionaries, are disposed around the different bits of the house.
I think you should read it because it's funny and gratuitously sexist.
I am besides for having the rooms particularly designed for virgins and young ladies, fitted up in the neatest and most delicate manner, that their tender minds may pass their time in them with less regret and be as little weary of themselves as possible. The mistress of the family should have an apartment in which she may easily hear everything that is done in the house. However, in these particulars, the customs of every country are always to be principally observed. The husband and the wife should each have a separate chamber. Not only that the wife, either when she lies in, or in case of any other indisposition, may not be troublesome to her husband, but also that in summertime each of them may lie alone wherever they may think fit. There's another good bit. I mean, he talks about where you got to put your boys and where you got to put your
boys and your elderly mother-in-law and your money.
Where do you put your boys?
Near the guests, so that they can talk to the guests and become
No,
familiar
that's your
with.
children. That's your sons.
Uh-huh.
Your boys, as in your servant boys, you got to put near the treasure.
True, but you've also got. Isn't that also where you have your mother-in-law?
Possibly, maybe, yeah. You got to put the nurses. You got to put the girls in the wardrobe.
Next to beyond the wardrobe. So it goes like library, husband, wife, wardrobe, girls.
And then the treasure is probably on the other side of the husband somewhere.
Yes, but on the other side of the husband is mother-in-law, boys' money, or something like that.
I mean, we see here, it's good that he makes like specific mention of the fact that your wife may be having her period and this will be annoying to you, so you have to put her in another room.
I thought laying in might be...
laying in is pregnant.
When you decide other indispositions may be...
Indisposition, I think, is... Well, I don't know. I thought by the time of this translation that was basically what it meant, but maybe I'm...
Yeah, I think it may be that and anything else.
The ancient mother who requires tranquility and repose should have a warm chamber.
There's lots of that sort of stuff in the same nature.
The butler's lodging should be near both the vault and the pantry. The grooms should lie near the stable. I mean, yeah, there's basically just a sort of identification of people with functions.
They're also sort of unbelievably stupid. Like, he's saying things that are incredibly obvious. In the early parts, he's really struggled. He's found it very hard because he's been reading all these old books and they don't make any sense and they aren't really relevant. And he's been like trying to piece together things and he's trying to be systematic. Like before this, he's gone through various types of buildings that should be in cities, which are churches, marketplaces, nunneries, monasteries, prisons, and various things about them. It's very important that your nunneries be shut up and very guarded, even more guarded than your fortresses, so that no one may go by and do damage to the nuns' chastities.
Oh, yeah, I forgot that bit. Yeah. Yes, the nuns should neither be too close to the city nor too far away, because both of those things are liable to give rise to villainy.
Yes. And yes, like villainy is a big problem. There mustn't be any chinks by which people could see in or see out.
He's worried about the nuns. The entrance into the Senate House ought to be made no less strong than handsome, for very many reasons, and particularly to the intent that no foolish, headstrong rabble, at the instigation of any seditious ringleader, may be able at any time to attack and insult the senators. Oh yeah, prisons. He thinks that they shouldn't just be like dungeons.
He thinks, yes, like you don't need to make them excessively cruel. You can be cruel to people independently if you would like. He also thinks there are multiple kinds. He says, this is what every ancient author has said about prisons. And he says a whole load of things, which include dividing them into 3 kinds. But some people agree and some people disagree. The 3 kinds being like for moral improvement of fallen women and delinquents, for debt, and for capital crimes.
There's discussion of various sorts of wretches in this this chapter.
Wretches, nastinesses.
Wretches and nastiness. Well, I mean, from all that, maybe we should go out into the countryside, which is the other...
Georgix. Yeah, on the farm. If you want to know what to do with your geese and what you should feed them on, he's been reading Varro. Is it Varro?
For a book on architecture, there's rather a lot on animal husbandry.
There aren't any classical books very much on architecture. There's Vitruvius. But there are a lot on how to run your farm, and there's a lot on how to run your family. And so he's rather taken from them.
There's a good bit about how if you let the moon shine in the window, if the moon's beams do not come in at the window, they will make your horse wall-eyed and give it a grievous cough.
I think this could be made into one of those ridiculous Japanese farm sims. Harvest Moon Varro edition.
Yeah, the moon? It's sort of like the moon is kind of like Freddy Krueger. Or
You've just
something.
got to treat everything as literally true. The bit on the farm is not really relevant.
Place your dove house with a view of the water. Make your hen house face south, etc., etc.
This goes on for pages and pages and pages. On and on in rhyming couplets for hours and hours.
So you've got your country estate. Where should your house be?
Not in the best bit of your lands, but in the most beautiful, so that you may admire it from all. This is unfair, by the way. Luke is asking me questions, and he's got it all in front of him.
I got the notes. Yeah, you've got better memory than me, though.
There's a bit where he says your summer rooms should be big and your winter ones small, because a great body of air is like a body of water, takes a long time to heat up.
It's not completely untrue, is it?
Yeah, he has all these sort of weird, like, practical notes in amongst the insane stuff.
Yeah, the principle for the design of these country houses is it's not possible to make a room for all seasons. And as much as possible, you need to have different ones for different times of year and probably facing different ways. And really, the best thing is to have multiple duplicates of all of the main sorts of rooms and to move around.
If we ever get on to Palladio, we'll talk about the reality of this. Palladio is good at it. Alberti didn't really do any country houses, though. He did a bit of mucking about with forts, although less than Brunelleschi.
Of course, he acknowledges sometimes it's not possible to build as many versions of every room as you might want. Yeah. And if in doubt, build for summer. Summer is the one to build for.
Which is correct in Italy, because Italy is mostly too hot and slightly too cold, and actually is a pretty ideal place to live a lot of the time. Particularly if you're a bit of the way up the hill.
And the other thing he says is, for God's sake, don't go having all these toilets. Have it outside. If a man is sick, let him make use of a close stool. But when he is in health, surely such nastiness cannot be too far off.
Yeah, people had this attitude well into the 1950s in the UK.
We should consult beauty as one of the main and principal requisites in anything which we have a mind should please others. How necessary our forefathers, men remarkable for their wisdom, looked upon this to be, appears, as indeed from almost every other thing they did, so particularly from their laws, their militia, their sacred and all other public ceremonies, which it is almost incredible what pains they took to adorn, insomuch that one would almost imagine they had a mind to have it thought that all these things, so absolutely necessary to their life of mankind, if stripped of their pomp and ornament, would be somewhat stupid and insipid. That was very convoluted.
He's talking about religion and civil ceremonies.
Oh, without ornament would be...
That the Romans, their religion and civil rights, without their pomp and ornament would seem a little silly and insipid.
You never quite know whether he's... Is he just talking about the Romans there?
No, he's not. He's talking about everything. He's a nihilist.
He's sort of saying that without architecture, all of these things are meaningless.
Yeah, they seem stupid. He's like the activities in themselves. I mean, I think that he thinks that, like, people are corrupt, religion doesn't make much sense, all of this stuff is hypocritical, but without beauty and, like, people making stuff good, it all looks stupid and boring. That's his kind of attitude. Every now and again, you get these things where he's just... It's like, I think, with the Tyrant's House stuff, all this stuff that people have literally taken to be him, this person wanting to, like, crush down on everyone. He's just saying that, like, our society is corrupt, turned on its head, everything is rubbish, like, you can't trust anyone, it's all nonsense, but I'm really into buildings and they're really cool.
Without buildings, nothing has meaning.
I'm all in favour of the, like, architecture-loving nihilist.
So he has a definition of ornament which he calls a kind of auxiliary brightness and improvement to beauty.
So we're now, by the way, in the, like, beauty section.
Which is the second 5 books. The theory of beauty and even ornament is pretty fugitive in these bits. We go over a lot of the same stuff again.
Very often you think, oh, he's coming to it. He's saying he's about to talk about how you should design a building or what beauty is, and then he doesn't say it. And he kind of, like, comes up and he marches us up and down the hill a lot of times.
So what is his theory of beauty? Why don't we do that?
Like, when people talk about him, they stand him up as this... I don't think anyone bothers to read books, you know.
No.
Not books written in Latin by, like, old cantankerous men. He's meant to be like, things are perfect. You've got to have, like, perfect harmony in circles and rational and harmony in all things.
A few times he says that beauty is this condition in which nothing can be added or taken away without making it worse. Yeah. But which is just basically a tautology, isn't it? That doesn't necessarily get you very much closer to it.
Yes, there's things he likes. I mean, I was looking through this. By the way, there's a lovely bit when we talk about how architecture arises, which I think is quite attractive, which is a separate thing. But there are things which he likes and which you can see him later in his career putting into practice. He has a great interest in some rather peculiar proportions which make his buildings fantastic. And he definitely likes that. But he also is just... He is someone who is saved by the fact that he loves buildings. Yeah. He's got taste. Part of the reason it doesn't make sense is because he's in Italy. He sees all these beautiful buildings. And he keeps saying things about them. Like, you know, he loves the Romanesque buildings. He loves the ancient Roman ruins. But they're beautiful, and the rules they follow are different, so his rules don't make any sense. I mean, he likes circles and harmony and those ideas, but he's not totally wedded to them, I don't think.
That architecture began in Asia, flourished in Greece, and was brought to perfection in Italy. Obviously, yeah. The art of building, as far as I can gather from the works of the ancients, spent the first vigor of its youth in Asia. It afterwards flourished among the Greeks, and at last came to full maturity in Italy.
Architecture started with, like, very rich tyrants, and as we know, when anyone's got money, they will be putting up buildings, and that's where it starts, and then competing with each other. But, like, the tyrants have created architecture by wanting to spend money and compete with each other. And then it goes to Greece, and in Greece, they mix light and dark, and circle and triangle and square.
And also elsewhere that he says that they don't have very many resources, that they have to make the most of what they can, and they have to make the most of the terrain and the region and all of that.
You've been trudging through all of this nonsense, and then you hit upon a sort of moment of beauty, and you think, how lovely. What a delight.
I shall only take notice that all arts were begot by chance and observation, and nursed by use and experience, and improved and perfected by reason and study. Thus we are told that physic was invented in 1,000 years by 1,000 men, and so too the art of navigation, as indeed all other arts have grown up by degrees from the smallest beginnings. I think he's very interested he definitely believes in experiment, doesn't he? He believes in experiment and in this kind of...
And although he, like, proposes some hard and fast rules, he really thinks the best thing is to try, and the most fruitful thing to drive on progress is competition.
Greece, finding that in these works she could not equal those nations in expense, resolved to try if she could not outdo them in ingenuity. She began therefore to trace and deduce this art of building, as indeed she did all others, from the very lap of nature itself, examining, weighing, and considering in all its parts, and with the greatest diligence and exactness, inquiring with the greatest strictness into the difference between those buildings which were highly praised and those which were disliked. Without neglecting the least particular, she tried all manner of experience, still tracing and keeping close to the footsteps of nature, mingling uneven numbers with even, straight lines with curves, light with shade, hoping that as it happens from the conjunction of male and female, she should by the mixture of these opposites hit upon some third thing that would answer her purpose.
So the idea that people say about him is that he likes this perfect ideal, like nothing taken away, nothing subtracted, everything should be a circle, things should be perfect. But actually what he says is, the most exciting thing is when you come across harmonious contrasts. If you've got a square, you should have a circle on the back of it, because it's exciting to the eye. You should always be striving to introduce diverse elements, different shapes, like evens with odds, light with dark, have contrasts, but you must do it in such a way that they all fit together at a single level, which is kind of like consonance and dissonance, like resolving chords. And that's what you get in his architecture, and that's what's very good. And that's a viable, in my opinion, theory of beauty, that it comes from the successful resolution of difference
Into this sort of gestalt
that you make
unity.
You make things that are disparate harmonious, where like the eye is excited, it doesn't feel it's wrong, but it's excited by the change. That's better than what they say about him, which is nonsense. I mean, to be honest, that's a better idea of beauty than a lot of people have.
He was a smart guy.
He's a smart guy.
He was a smart guy. We've got to give him credit. He was a very clever guy. He probably read more books by the age of 16 than I'm ever going to.
Yes, that man's forgotten more than you'll ever know.
Well, I mean, should we talk about what people say about him? Should we talk, because we go on to this sort of sacred geometry
sure.
in the next book.
Which is also not what it is said to be.
Well, I don't know if this is just the translation, but there's a lot of peculiar chat about temples.
No, he says temple. He says templum, which is fun. Well, I think he says templum, but templum doesn't mean temple. I think he's using it to mean temple. A templum is the sacred enclosure or cut. Vision of the sacred land from the unsacred land. That's what it means in Latin. It doesn't mean a building.
In the previous chapter, he has a long bit where he talks about sacred land and sacred prohibitions. Yeah. And he's very interested in all that, you know, the particular things which you weren't allowed to do in this place or that place. The particular people.
Black cockerels, menstruating women.
In some temples, you weren't allowed to leave until you'd made a sacrifice. Or
yes. No frogs or throwing things or, all that sort of stuff.
The parts of the temple are two: the portico and the inside. Some temples are round, some square, and others have many sides. But he does say it's manifest that nature delights principally in round figures.
His love of circles is something which is famous about him. Yeah. I use famous in inverted commas. This is Renaissance architectural theory. And it's strange because it comes up several times, but always in an incredibly offhand way, which is something you said. I think both sides of the argument have got a case here. He says it 4 times at least that I can think of. The circle is the best form. But he never really elaborates. And then he devotes all his time to talking about not circles and the best ways of doing them.
It's interesting because I think from one particular point of view, he talks about how the ideal form of a fortified city is a circle, obviously, because it has the shortest wall for the greatest area. But he doesn't overstress it.
But he then says, but really, you actually just want one made with straight walls because straight walls are easier. So you could do it with one with 4, 5, 6, 16, or up to 24 sides.
Or also, actually, the most important thing is terrain, and lots of cities have very different shapes because that's the
terrain they're in. And then he talks a lot about how to make most of an escarpment, flatland, a river. Likewise, when he's going through his types of buildings, when we're talking about nuns and prisons and things, he says, and what of the temples? Circles best. Here are all of the not circles you can do. It's funny in 2 ways, but because he doesn't really talk about real circular examples. There are obviously circular temples in Greece and Rome. There are late Roman circular churches. There are Romanesque circular churches. There are Gothic circular churches.
The rotunda is kind of a thing, isn't it, in like Romanesque?
Yeah, I mean, the Basilica in Ravenna, which is a real good one. But there's St. Stephen's in Rome. In Italy, circular churches go all the way through time. But he doesn't really talk about them. Oh, do you want to head up this bit on like column proportions? I found it tiresome.
This is really the part where the flavour of this as a book entirely without illustrations can be given. At some point I wrote down, "A picture is worth 1,000 words, tested to destruction in reverse."
Yeah. I don't believe this for a minute, but this is apparently how he gave instructions to builders. I mean, the Corinthian column is quite fun. But all that stuff about door jambs, proportions of door jambs.
Our rules for the Ionic capital are as follows. Let the whole height of the capital be 1/2 the diameter of the bottom of the column. Let us divide this height into 19 parts or minutes, 3 of which we must give to the abacus, 4 to the thickness of the volute fixed to the ovolo, and the other fixed below we must leave for the turn of the volutes on each side. The breadth of the abacus each way must be equal to the diameter of the top of the shafts. The breadth of the rind which is to terminate in the scroll must both in the front and the back of the capital be equal to the abacus. This rind must fall down on each side, winding round like a snail shell. The centre of the volute on the right side must be distant from that on the left 2 and 30 minutes, and from the highest point of the abacus 12 minutes. The method of turning this volute is as follows. About the centre of the volute, describe a little circle, the semi-diameter of which must be one of the aforementioned minutes. This is the eye of the volute. In the circumference of this little circle, make 2 points opposite to one another, one above and the other below. Then fix 1 foot of your compasses into the uppermost point, and extend the other to the line that divides the abacus from the rind, and turn it outwards from the capital till you have made a perfect semicircle, ending perpendicular under the lowest point or dot in the eye of the volute. Then contract your compasses, ... and I haven't taken any more, but
that's maybe 40% of the description of one column capital. Yeah. He goes on to describe every architectural element and several building types.
It's very odd. It's a little bit like being in the sort of man in the middle between the computer and the CNC laser cutter or something. It's like,
yeah. I mean, actually, they're also not that. I mean, I'm sure they were good in his time, but they're not. The guy who did the illustrations for this did that version of the Ionic column, and the volutes are not quite right. But I really feel that's a minor point compared to the fact that it goes on for 40, 50 pages, but these are big pages, quarto pages, so like A4s, 40, 50 A4s of this stuff. I found it borderline unreadable.
Yeah, I just skipped through it all.
It's irritating because it actually has like weird, witty asides scattered sparsely through it.
The breadth of these windows must not be less than 3/4 of the intercolumniation, and their height may very conveniently be twice their breadth. Their headpiece must be on a line with the top of the columns exclusive of the capitals if these windows be made square, but if they are round, their arch may come almost even with the architrave, and so lower than you think fit to diminish the arch, but they must never rise above the tops of the columns.
On and on and on. I did notice a few things while I was going through it. He has some interesting approaches to proportions. He does some things which are quite unusual. He thinks it is good that the proportion of the plan should be reflected in elevations. So that the plan of a room should, for example, be the shape of a doorway to that room.
That's strange, yeah.
Not in all circumstances, but he says that sort of thing. And also that the colonnade or even a doorway coming out of a square should have the same proportional system as the plan of the square. He also outlines like ratios that he likes. So some of this is like an observation of Greek things, and then some is stuff he likes. I mean, Greek and Roman things.
He's pretty hot on entasis and these kind of subtle things about
different versions of it. You should use it sometimes, but not always.
This is bulginess of columns for the uninitiated.
But also, he does, I think, touch on the whole building, like being slightly distorted as well.
There's a good bit where he's like, it's unknown whether the ancients used chimneys. This is a subject of like great dispute. Well, his compromise is that they burned some kind of charcoal which left no smoke.
It's a bit more complicated than that. You've simplified it. It's the correct observation that for the burning of offerings in temples, they had no chimneys. The smoke rises through a hole in the roof. This is correct, I think. Most of the burnt offerings were done outside. That's where all the religious ceremonies went on. He lays out proportions and then says you can do it like this or this or this or this. And his system is strangely mixed. Like, the outlines of the basilica are exactly a basilica. The ones in the illustrations are a bit dodgy because they're like post-Palladian. But he also kind of likes some Romanesque stuff, but won't describe that in proportion. He'll just describe that, like, for coverings, the best roofs for churches, in the churches section, gold mosaics describing the many and varied things that happen in the Bible. Which is interesting because you would think that's exactly what they're against, the Renaissance. The Renaissance is seen as like overturning this stuff. My feeling is that anyone who liked architecture, who was in Tuscany, cannot have looked at or like the buildings in Pisa or the Florence Baptistry and thought this is not high quality architecture and consequently has to have a system where they make the two things work. He's describing something in perfect proportions in a classical model and then keeps putting bits of Gothic architecture in it. And Romanesque architecture and say the best way is like this. At this point, I was looking for things that he had done in his architecture. There's a bit when he's going through chapels, and then there's a bit when he's going through miniature chapels and sepulchres. And he did one. And what he described, he did one later, and what he described is almost that ideally it should be a rectangle with a circular apse at the back in the model of a miniature temple with symbols on the sides, like the Egyptians, who said symbols are better than words because words will fade in meaning in time, like the words of the Etruscans, which I see dug up everywhere and yet cannot read. So you should have a little temple with a rectangular plan and an arched back as a miniature temple covered in symbols with a crenellated roof. And that's exactly what he did later
in San Pancrazio.
Giovanni Rucellai for his tomb.
Yeah.
And it's pretty cool. Very enigmatic. Also, he talks a little bit about these like square elevational arrangements where you organize things in harmonic squares, which I think is kind of what he did for the Rucellai church that's outside the train station in Florence. He's got a bit when he talks about, I'm not for this fashion that sprung up 200 years or so ago of every man, Jack, and like husbandman throwing up a watchtower about the place so that these cities look like as many broken teeth.
The proper height for buildings about a square is 1/3 of the breadth of the open area, or 1/5 at the least. I would also have the porticos raised above the level of the ground 1/5 part of their breadth. It's a real maths puzzle.
The last two sections are on harmonics and repairing of old buildings, and I haven't read them.
So the harmonics bit, again he's restating in a different way this idea of the sort of relationship of parts to a whole, that they have a kind of congruity where like beauty and grace arises. That it's not that they're the same, but it's that there is sort of something about them.
I saw that he was playing around with harmonic sequences like thirds, fifths, like musical ones. Again, all written out in words. This is pure ASCII graphics, this. Well, there's a little bit of like dots.
For moderate platforms also, we may use that proportion which arises from the sesquitertion doubled in the same manner as the former, wherein the length and the breadth will be as 9 and 16.
Yeah. So it's like you can go in triples where you go 2, 6, 9, or you can go in thirds, or you can go in fifths, and it's like the ratios. Like some things want a ratio where you go 2, 3, 4. Some things want a ratio where you go 2, 4, 6. Some things you want to go 2, 4, 8. Some things you want to go whatever the fifth is like. But like there can be a bonus on trying to understand his modular system, and I will try and take it on. Because at the moment I was just scanning for bits that were not what it was about. Please understand us. It is extraordinarily difficult to read 100 pages of someone describing this thing should be this wide, and then this thing should be this much wider, and then divide it into 36, and then 2/36 on the left should be... I haven't seen anyone else ever talk about this.
It's interesting, isn't it?
And there's a last chapter which I haven't got to at all. The illustrations are like someone smelling stuff like gas coming out of the earth.
It's all sorts of things which can go wrong with buildings, really. And then, ways that you can fix them again. He's a fascinating character, and I can see why people are into him. He has a particular vision of his own sort of mind as well. There's a nice story in the Clarke essay where it talks... One of the things he talks about in his autobiography is that he says, I used to be susceptible to colds, or I used to be that I couldn't get too hot or too cold, but I conquered those things by going out riding without a hat or something. Like he's deliberately sort of subjects his body to certain things in order to rid himself.
He believes he's unbelievably better than everyone. And that but
it all comes out of the reason's conquest of the body, of everything else. I don't know. I mean...
It's funny because he's also wry and ironic.
And it's not like he thinks he knows everything.
No, very often he will say, I do not know of these which is best. Or I don't know what to make of this. Or I don't believe this. Normally the people writing these books are very certain of themselves. It's unusual. And also, it's unusual in a work of architectural theory to have jokes, particularly an old one. It's got to end better than Vitruvius. Vitruvius, stops talking about buildings, and the end is just mechanical contrivances, mainly catapults.
The end of this is...
It sort of ends with the things for destroying the buildings.
Yeah. He's sort of talking about repairing old walls with lime and chalk and other things. There is another thing not foreign to our present purpose. Many parts of a building, from being either placed too low or encompassed with walls not high enough, seem less and more contracted than they really are. Whereas when they are either raised upon a higher platform or have some addition made to the height of the walls, they seem at a distance much larger than they did before. It is also certain that a handsome disposition of the apertures, and placing the door and windows gracefully, gives all the apartments a greater share, both of dignity and elegance, than is to be imagined. The end.
Yeah, I mean, in its structure, it doesn't feel like a whole. At the beginning, we were talking about it as being written over 10-year period.
Yeah, we don't really know when. Actually.
We don't know, but it does have the feel of something which has been assembled over a long time out of bits. Like having multiple starts in it as well. The beginning of book 5 feels like a start. But also all the recapitulations of the same thing. If you were writing it out according to a plan, you wouldn't do that. It seems very much to me an assemblage of things. We've got to cut him some slack for being right at the beginning. He's got Vitruvius as a model, but the prospect of trying to say everything you can think of about buildings is implausible. You have to have a system to break things down, and he's trying to do that. He's repeatedly trying to organize the knowledge that he has and create sort of hierarchies of information and taxonomies. I just wish there were less examples from classical literature.
I think they're funny. But they are quite boring as well.
They are excruciatingly boring mostly, and very occasionally funny. It's not like they will really say what they will say. It will say Hesiod says, build it 3 feet tall. Varro says, build it 2 feet wall. It's boring. It's at the beginning of each section. It's very hard to read and unenlightening in the extreme. It doesn't even tell you really what those classical authors are saying, and skims over stuff so much because he's trying to get all of this classical stuff in that it becomes meaningless. Like he will just say 2 or 3 words on one thing.
But that's what lots of authors in antiquity did as well, isn't it? They were always
it's like an epitome of an epitome. Yeah.
Also, it's sort of unknown what the relationship of this is to his architectural practice. He was, in the decade when he was writing this, he would get started with lots of buildings. A lot of them start in the 1440s. There's the Palazzo Rucellai And there is also the Rimini. And Santa Maria Novella starts in 1448, which is also within the window given for the writing of this book. So those are all pretty major things.
With Rucellai, he didn't do it himself. He just specified the elevation. I mean, I think he spent quite a while in Rimini. We'll go over this stuff. Yeah, it's difficult to disentangle. He's clearly thinking about it a lot, having previously worked in other fields. He's not super young. Like, he's 40. I mean, he's a young architect.
Yeah, people lived a long time in the old days, in the age of gold.
I don't know, he managed a proper lifespan, didn't he?
Yeah, I think he died in his late 60s or something.
Okay, how do you rate this book?
I mean, it was fun. I liked all the bizarre stuff. He's right about this quality of, like, there being a sort of a wholeness, or there being a sort of a closure to a successful work. That it's something which kind of creates and inhabits its own universe. And within that, it might have lots of different parts. It might have lots of contrasts, like a great kind of richness and diversity. I think also that in the experience of designing things, you're dealing with a complexity of lots of different variables, but there is a certain moment at which the whole kind of comes into view, a sort of resonance of its parts. Like there's a sort of moment of simplification where it's like, oh yeah, things kind of make sense here, and all of the different contradictions and strengths and weaknesses and everything else from this point of view sort of are making sense. He didn't have a lot to draw on, and I think that he possesses a lot of insight about what that process is like. For all that he does seem a little bit abstruse and a little bit disconnected from it. I really wish
he could relied on his own intellect more, and the nonsense that he was reading in books that were not relevant a bit less.
I wonder though, but I mean, I think part of that is people are always writing at cross purposes to the thing which is actually, which they're actually into. They're always bouncing off something else.
He loves buildings, and he sees a lot of good ones, and he can't really make a system for what's good about them because they're so different and so complicated. He manages to create order in his own works by making them a particular thing, but I don't think he's someone who only likes things that are like what he designs. And he has this tremendous lust for knowledge and a great sense of wonder in the material world, which kind of sends his mind rambling off in the...
Yeah, I'm interested in unravelling the buildings.
I haven't seen them. They're striking.
Striking, complicated, and I think that this idea of making the most, or sort of negotiating with what's already there, is something which is very strongly...
Yeah, I mean, essentially none of them, with the exception of that little tiny tomb, they're all working with existing buildings. He wrote a lot of books. More books than buildings. It's pretty rare. Like, there aren't that many people who write interesting books and do good buildings. I mean, there are some. He's one of them. Any thoughts on the bonus?
Well, there are options. We might do some of the other books.
Yeah, and I wanna like later ask some of the questions about this. So that will either come out in a bonus or in the episode where we talk about the buildings.
Well, you've got to allow us to kind of develop our thoughts as we go. It's the only way we know how to do it. If you want bonus material...
And there's quite a bit up there. There's a big back catalogue. For those of you who have listened to the 100-odd hours of stuff we've put out, there's another 15 or something.
It's quite cheap to access. You have to pay us $3 a month.
Which you will have our eternal thanks.
It does a lot of good, and it pays for the podcast to exist. Yeah, we're not those kind of rich podcasters you've heard about.
What are they? Oh, no, there are all those people making loads of money on Patreon, I suppose. I suspect there are many more like us that aren't. But it does pay for Matt, which is pretty transformative. And in fact, without that, I would say the podcast would
not exist.
Almost not exist.
Yeah.
Or at least be so occasional as to be almost useless.
Yeah, patreon.com /about_buildings.
But also go on the Instagram, because up there, unlike Alberti, much superior to Alberti, we have radio vision. You can look at the pictures as you go along, providing you look at it a while after the episode has come out.
It's all there. Yeah. Lovely. Thanks.
Nighty night.
Bye.